Alright, we're gonna wait for this to load up and we're ready to go. Spain. Now, we've been talking about the United Kingdom, we've been talking about the EU, we've been talking about integration, super governmentalism, the single market, and your question might be asking, why are we going to talk about Spain now? Well, Spain is actually one of the examples of how the single market or how the European Union can have its difficulties along the way. And I appreciate the fact that we've been able to understand more about how supergovernmentalism kind of overshadows many of these different member states and kind of dictates with regards to what countries can do and what countries can't do. So, Spain is a perfect example of how a country can join the EU, have great prosperity, but have some sort of limitations. So what's the deal with Spain? Well, I mean, this political satire is very interesting. I mean, you have the Germans on the top. It's no surprise that the Germans have an above average GDP. They're actually one of the only countries in the 28 member states that actually produce net growth in the past couple of years. And then you have the UK kind of being that second to first in position. And then you have the Frenchies, you have the Spaniards, and then you have Greece. Greece is all the way in the bottom. You can see right here. They are the people who are struggling and they are suffering immensely. But that's a topic for another situation. When we start to see the historical background of Spain, Spain was very distant from much of the EU until the latter part of the century. They had a dictator, fascist dictator, between 36 to 39. There was a Spanish Civil War, and he took power in 36. Regime ruled all the way to 75. And during this time, there was a stagnation of growth within the country. Sure, they had tourism, they had different investments going on, but nothing in comparison in par with what other countries were experiencing at this time. And Spain didn't actually join the EU or the EEC until 1986. And under Franco's tenure, much of the economic advancement was very limited. It was very touristy based, and there wasn't much growth for the domestic sector. Spain didn't produce high employment. Spain was under difficulties economically, advancing, and it proved a difficulty for the Spaniards. And even when they joined the European Union with the intentions of increasing their economic productivity, it was still a challenge. It was still a challenge, and the eurozone crisis abruptly just derailed this progress that they were going through. So what happened? What happened? I really like this image here. You might see the bull coming in, and something very common when the Spaniards is the rodeo, right? Not the rodeo. Actually, like um, the big spectacular a man with a red coat and a bull is trying to chase him. And it's funny because the guy is obviously in danger, and he says, "Don't. I'll manage it." While the bull's heading forward. And that's what happened with Spain. In 2002, Spain joins the Eurozone. They begin to invest in Spain. You have this availability of low credit. You have the ability to borrow sums of money from the EU in order to quote unquote progress your economy. And it looked promising. In 2007, you see a huge spurge and increase in the housing sector, and you have a capital surplus of $83 billion in 2005 and $155 billion in 2008. So the housing market becomes one of the main reasons of investing. And you have to understand that once you start investing this amount of money into one sector of the economy, you begin to slowly deter or diminish other sectors. So one big proponent of this was that many young people were thinking, hey, I can go into construction and make twice the amount of money without going to school, as opposed to graduating with a degree from school and not earning the same amount of money. And then this is where big corporations started to come in, invest money, and all the construction workers were making very, very good money. But how did this become a problem? So you see, the Spaniards love having their houses. They love having home ownership. And if you compare home ownership to other countries in the European Union, only about 45% of Germans own their own home. Most of them just let apartments or flats. But when you look at the home ownership in Spain, it was 80%. And as a matter of fact, per 1,000 residents, 160 had a secondary home, compared to 75 on average within the European Union. So this home bubble is a very, very important driving factor to this Spaniard bubble. And in 2008 is when that bubble just popped. It burst, and on the right hand side, I actually put one of the pictures of an airport. Actually, Spain constructed an airport, and after the bubble, they basically never finished it because they couldn't. Despite the fact that they poured millions of dollars into this airport project, they were not able to construct and finish it off because it was all speculative. So housing prices fall by 27%. Construction sector, 70% of the economy just starts falling. Within a matter of months, 2 million jobs are lost. Increased compensation by 6%. Despite the fact that you're losing all of these jobs, the Spaniards still went ahead and they raised compensation for specific sectors by 6%. And the most interesting part is that Spain's banking was unregulated. So the cajas, or the banqueros, the bankers, had no responsibility to disclose information. They had no responsibility to tell the EU or other parts of official government, hey, we are engaged in these really risky behaviors, but I think we'll be okay. And the way the Spain is divided is into different, you could think of them as states, different states, and each state had their own authority, their own autonomy to think about what they want to do. So they engage in risky, unregulated loans against the international financial reporting standards, and you had these difficulties. So, Bankia Group, Spain's third largest lender, showed 40.9 million euros in profit, but not $3.3 billion in loss. Euros in loss. So it's really interesting, the Spaniard bubble that was being created. So much money they were reporting that they had earned, but they weren't reporting the losses. And Spain was tied to the Eurozone. So they gave up their monetary sovereignty and they relied on the fixed currency, therefore they couldn't devalue their currency. And again, going back to the concept of super-governmentalism, once they adopted the single market, which is what we spoke about in the earlier video, once they adopted the single market, there was no going back for them. They couldn't defluctuate their interest rate in order to allow more investment, in order to prevent people from purchasing more, and ultimately having a better economy. They couldn't lower their interest rate. They had no autonomy over their economy because as soon as they joined the European Union, all that autonomy was lost. And again, going back to the European Union and the super-governmentalist approach. So how did they remedy the situation? The Spaniards just continued driving into danger, and they started to avoid any sort of further difficulties. But once the bubble was burst, it was very difficult to go back. And this is where we start seeing the European Union being involved more and more and more. One thing to understand about the single market, as I mentioned in the previous video, is the economies are integrated. It's very difficult to sway from the economies. It's very difficult to say Germany's doing well, Poland's not doing that well, but that's okay. No, it's actually not okay. Well, Poland's not the best example. Let's say Spain or Greece. Yeah, they're doing well, but they could do a little bit better, but that's not our problem. No, it is your problem. And that's why the political satire image in the beginning, where I was showing the European Union and Germany, you see that they have a responsibility. At the end of the day, they're going to have to extend their hand. And this is something I really want you to understand, because when we start looking at the United Kingdom, they also have to put up that burden. So Bankia receives 19 billion in euro bailout, and with the bailout, it increases the deficit and the debt, and decreases the credit rating. So Spain is just basically in a bursted bubble, and they have to pick up their remains. So the government attempts to be more fiscal in 2011, amends constitution to increase trust in financial markets, and they slowly try to improve the situation. Spain on the up curve, it pays up the the EU aid package of 2012. They project a 2.3% increase in economic growth, expected 1 million additional jobs between 2014 and 2015, and they're still attempting to recover from that housing burst. And looking at this, it's what did the EU do to remedy the situation? Because despite the fact that Spain is in a bubble, they bursted their bubble, the responsibility is of the EU. Remember, when we started looking at the Commission, we spoke about that in the earlier video. When we started looking at the Commission is responsible in delegating these financial difficulties or risks that they're assessing. And I put a list of different remedies that they went ahead and created. Not because I want you to see or remember any of these, because I don't think that this is too important for what we'll be talking about with the United Kingdom, but it's really to see how much the EU has involved itself within Spain. Spain has basically given up their autonomy and told the EU, you know what, EU, if you have to put austerity measures, you're going to go ahead and put austerity measures. And we have to comply because we messed up. We messed up with our housing bubble, and we have to pay those costs. So Spain is that situation where we see how super governmentalism takes control of the difficulties of a country, and unfortunately brings down other member states. And with all these member states that are being brought down, it's no question why you have countries like the United Kingdom saying, hey, we don't want to be part of this mess. We do not want to comply with these dictations that the super governmentalism approach of the European Union is having on us. And did all of this work for the Spaniards? Well, it depends. After years of being Europe's shakiest economies, it's managed to bring back stricter reforms and bring back economic growth. But unemployment rate is still very, very high, and it has increased poverty rates. For example, if you're 25 years or younger, the unemployment rate for youth is about 25%. Again, housing bubble, many people went to construction as opposed to school, and it creates a deficit, and many people in Spain are experiencing that. So what I want you to take away is Spain became part of the EU. They had this idea of progress, and they were going to experience that progress, but unfortunately, through the availability of the EU, and when it came down to loans and it came down to low interest loans, they started to take advantage of that. They started to use all this money. They created this housing bubble. They believed that this can be the new revolution of Spain, but it ended up being a complete backfire in the economy. And then it left many construction projects unfinished. It led many people to unemployment. And most importantly, it damaged the reputation and the single market unity and importance and long-term economic success of the single market. And that's one thing that you should take into consideration when you start to wonder a little bit more about why did the United Kingdom decide to hold this referendum, and is this referendum something that's applicable? And with that, I'm gonna leave you all to think about that. And in conclusion, it's slow progress for recovery, and there's potential for faster growth. But you start seeing how this long borrowing problem is becoming an issue, and this image here about it's a house of cards, ready to fall, and that's something that many countries are trying to avoid, specifically the UK. So thank you for watching this video, and hopefully you keep this in consideration when we're looking more regards to the EU.